David Miller had never imagined that his life, once defined by concrete, glass, and deadlines in the bustling chaos of Los Angeles, would find its new rhythm among vines curling silently under the Californian sun. An architect by profession, he had spent years designing spaces for others, turning investors' ambitions into towering complexes, shopping centers, and sterile housing projects that all carried his signature precision but none of his soul. After the sudden death of his Uncle Richard, a man who had devoted his final decades to cultivating a modest vineyard tucked into the foothills outside Sonoma, David inherited not just land, but a legacy he hadn't anticipated would affect him so deeply. At first, he considered selling. The vineyard was remote, the house old, and the fields demanded attention he doubted he could give. Yet, when he walked the rows for the first time, the heavy scent of soil and the quiet geometry of the trellises spoke to something long suppressed within him, a longing for permanence and creation not bound by contracts or investors, but by earth and time itself. The locals had known Richard as a solitary man, not unkind but protective of his vines, and they treated David with cautious curiosity, unsure if he was another city relative ready to strip the land of its roots and sell it to developers. But David had no such intention. His career in the city had already soured him with guilt. He remembered projects where families were displaced, where small homes were demolished to erect towers no one from the old neighborhood could afford. The vineyard, in its fragile, aging state, felt like a chance at redemption, a place where he could use his discipline not to erase but to preserve. The first weeks he spent cleaning Richard's tool shed, patching leaks in the farmhouse roof, and sketching plans for gradual improvements, not radical redesigns. In the evenings, when the sun dipped behind the rolling hills and shadows stretched long across the vines, David sat on the porch with a glass of his uncle's last bottled vintage and listened to the rustle of leaves. For the first time in years, silence felt like a companion rather than a threat. Yet peace never comes without its watchers. The adjoining property belonged to Carl Benson, a widower who had lived in the area all his life, a man with a reputation for remembering every line of every deed and holding grudges longer than most held mortgages. David noticed him on several occasions, standing just beyond the fence, his figure stooped yet somehow unyielding, eyes fixed not on David but on the vines themselves, as though measuring them, recalling something, or perhaps laying quiet claim. Their first conversation was curt. Carl introduced himself without extending a hand, remarking that the vineyard had once been smaller, that boundaries were different in his father's day, that newcomers rarely understood the way land had always been divided among the locals. David, unsure whether it was neighborly small talk or veiled accusation, nodded politely, sensing a disapproval that was heavier than the words themselves. Still, David tried to keep to his work, rising early to prune and tying the shoots with care. At night he studied viticulture books, pages smudged with notes, diagrams filling his sketch pads where once skyscrapers had grown. He told himself that he would earn respect through effort, not words, and that in time even Carl would see that he was no careless outsider. Yet, beneath the quiet surface of his days was a current of unease, a feeling that the vineyard was not merely an inheritance but contested ground, and that his presence here had already disturbed an old balance. The hills absorbed his footsteps, the vines accepted his hands, but from the corner of his vision there was always Carl's window glowing dimly in the evening, a reminder that another pair of eyes, sharp and unrelenting, never stopped measuring where his property ended and David's began. It was on a pale morning in late spring, when the light still carried the coolness of dawn and the vineyard was cloaked in a faint mist that lifted slowly as if reluctant to leave, that David first realized the quiet order of his days had been disturbed by something far more deliberate than mere coincidence or neighborly curiosity, for as he walked down the rows of vines with a bucket of tools in hand, ready to replace a few old wires that had loosened during the night winds, he stopped, short at the sight of a freshly erected fence line cutting across the southern edge of the property. The structure was not temporary or improvised as one might expect from a farmer trying to pen livestock for a day, but a sturdy arrangement of posts driven deep into the soil, taut wire strung with mechanical precision, and a line so straight it suggested not haste but planning, as though the man who had put it there intended for it to stay for decades. The fence did not follow the known boundary David had studied carefully in the survey documents his uncle left behind. It intruded almost brazenly into the vineyard, slicing through 2 rows of healthy vines and leaving them stranded on the wrong side, as if they had been stolen overnight by a silent hand. For a moment he thought there must have been some misunderstanding. Perhaps the county had ordered boundary adjustments he was unaware of, or perhaps the posts marked a temporary easement. Yet the longer he stared, the more his unease thickened. For, nailed onto the center post was a weathered tin sign that read simply, "Private Property," its edges rusted, but its placement fresh. David dropped his tools and marched along the fence until he reached the far corner where the ground dipped toward a cluster of oaks. And there he saw Carl Benson, standing with the calm posture of a man waiting for exactly this confrontation. His hands folded over the top of a shovel, his boots pressed firmly into the earth like roots. Carl greeted him not with hostility, but with the heavy certainty of someone who had rehearsed his words. He claimed in a voice low but unwavering that the land now fenced had always been part of his property, that his late wife's family once harvested here, and that only a clerical error in the past decades had allowed Richard, David's uncle, to extend the vineyard beyond its rightful line. To prove his assertion, he pulled from his coat a folded sheaf of paper, yellowed at the edges yet strangely uncreased, a photocopy of an old deed map with ink that seemed too sharp, too modern, to be as aged as Carl implied. He held it as if it were scripture, pointing to the vague lines and faded signatures that, according to him, justified the intrusion. David felt his pulse quicken with anger and disbelief, for he knew the documents he possessed were official, notarized, and stamped, their authenticity never questioned by surveyors or tax authorities, yet in Carl's manner there was no doubt, no hesitation. Only the conviction of a man who had decided that truth was not in the paperwork but in his memory and will. David attempted reason, reminding Carl that property boundaries had been confirmed repeatedly by county surveyors, that Richard had paid taxes on this land for decades without contest, and that if Carl truly believed in his claim there were legal channels to pursue rather than overnight construction. But Carl's eyes hardened, his tone sharpened, and he said with quiet menace that courts were slow, neighbors were quicker, and that sometimes the soil remembered better than any bureaucrat's ink. It was a phrase that unsettled David more than the fence itself, because it carried with it not just defiance but a hint of something ritualistic, as if Carl believed the land was bound to him by something older than law. The days that followed were thick with tension. David attempted to work around the fence, pruning and watering as usual. Yet every time he reached the southern rows he felt a jolt of helplessness, for the vines beyond the wire seemed already lost to him, unreachable as though they had been amputated. He considered calling the sheriff, but neighbors warned him that Carl was stubborn, litigious, and skilled at bending stories until they favored his side. Rumors spread that Carl had fought boundary disputes before and had always come away with something, if not the land itself, then concessions or settlements. One elderly neighbor whispered to David that Carl had once convinced a widow to relinquish part of her pasture simply because he produced an old map no one else could disprove. The case never reached court, but the woman moved away within a year, broken by the pressure. David resolved not to yield. He visited the county clerk's office, requesting copies of every survey and deed related to his property. The clerks, though polite, shuffled uncomfortably when they realized what he sought, and one even mentioned offhand that a request for the same documents had been made only weeks earlier by someone local. The implication was clear. Carl had been preparing this strike for some time. When David finally held the official maps in his hands, stamped with the county seal and clear in their delineation of his boundaries, he felt both vindicated and weary, for he knew proof on paper meant little if Carl's strategy was to exhaust him through intimidation. What truly marked the escalation, however, was not the fence or the documents, but the subtle acts that followed. Tools left outside overnight began disappearing. A pile of vine trimmings he had prepared for compost was scattered across the path, as though kicked by a boot. One morning he found a dead rabbit at the base of the fence, its body unmarked but unnaturally stiff, placed almost ceremoniously where he could not miss it. None of these incidents could be proven to Carl, yet the message was unmistakable. The vineyard was under siege, not by strangers or vandals, but by the man next door, cloaked in neighborly history and false papers. In the quiet of his farmhouse at night, David sat at the kitchen table surrounded by maps, deeds, and Richard's old journals, trying to anchor himself in evidence, in fact, in the rational world he had once trusted as an architect. But every creak of the porch boards, every flicker of light from Carl's window across the property line, reminded him that this was no longer about reason alone. It was about endurance, about whether he had the will to defend not just land, but the fragile sense of belonging he had only just begun to cultivate. The catalyst had been set, and the conflict no longer lay in the future. It was already here, woven into the soil beneath his feet, written into the vines he had promised to protect, and embodied in the unyielding figure of a neighbor who believed that time and intimidation could erase the truth. The first real escalation came not with another fence post driven into the ground or some crude argument at the property line, but with a series of carefully calculated maneuvers that revealed Carl Benson was not content to let his false claim rest on paper alone. One morning, David received a letter from the county zoning board, terse and bureaucratic, informing him that a complaint had been lodged against his vineyard for unauthorized expansion and improper use of agricultural land. The language was stiff, almost indifferent, but the weight of it fell like a stone because David knew immediately who had filed it. The accusation alleged that several rows of vines had been planted illegally beyond the designated parcel boundaries, essentially echoing Carl's claim in the form of an official warning. Though David had all the surveys proving otherwise, he understood the significance. Carl had moved the conflict from the soil into the machinery of local administration, a realm where delays, hearings, and procedural entanglements could wear down even the most patient of owners. David drove to the zoning office the same afternoon, determined to cut through the nonsense before it gathered momentum. He sat across from a weary clerk who, though sympathetic, explained that every complaint had to be reviewed, that field inspectors would be sent in the coming weeks, and that during this time David was prohibited from making any structural changes to the disputed area. In practice, this meant he could not touch the southern rows, not even to prune them, without risking further sanction. It was a small victory for Carl, but a sharp one because it froze David's ability to care for the very vines under attack. As he left the office, he caught sight of Carl's truck idling at the curb across the street, its driver leaning casually against the hood as though he had all the time in the world. Their eyes met briefly, and in Carl's expression there was no triumphal grin, no taunting smirk, only the steady, cold gaze of someone who believed persistence alone would suffocate his opponent. Days turned heavier. David returned home each evening to small but unmistakable signs that his presence was being contested. Once, the lock on his tool shed was jammed with dirt, so compacted he had to dismantle the entire latch. Another time, the irrigation valve for the southern block had been twisted fully open during the night, leaving the soil drenched and vulnerable to mold. He told himself these were petty acts beneath his attention, but in the dark hours he could not ignore the gnawing thought that Carl was watching his every move, waiting for him to falter. Even the workers he occasionally hired to assist with repairs began to hesitate. One young man refused a second day's labor after seeing Carl loitering near the fence, muttering that he did not want to get caught in whatever was happening between you two. The vineyard was becoming isolated, its owner left to defend it with nothing but documents, his own 2 hands, and a growing sense of siege. What unsettled David most was the discovery that the county records were no longer as complete as he remembered. When he returned to the archives to collect additional certified copies of Richard's deeds, he found that one survey map, the clearest and oldest, had been checked out and never returned. The clerk, apologetic but evasive, could not say by whom, only that the request had been filed under a temporary research exemption. The timing left little doubt that Carl had either removed or tampered with it, though proving such interference was impossible. Without that document, David still had other evidence, but the absence gnawed at him like a missing cornerstone in a structure that suddenly felt less stable. The tension reached a new level during an afternoon when David, weary from pruning, walked toward the disputed fence and found Carl standing there with 2 other men. They were not neighbors, but strangers, rough in their bearing, dressed in work clothes that bore no insignia of any company. They carried measuring rods and clipboards, pretending to take notes as Carl spoke to them in low tones. When David approached, Carl raised his voice deliberately, saying that buyers had already shown interest in acquiring the disputed section for future development, and that the vineyard might soon benefit from having new roads and utilities. Nearby, the men ignored David completely, their presence radiating not authority but intimidation. When he demanded to know by what right they were surveying land that was not theirs, Carl answered only with a thin smile and the phrase, "It pays to prepare early, Mr. Miller." That night, David could not sleep. He sat in his study surrounded by Richard's old notes and diaries, searching for some anchor that would remind him the vineyard was not fragile, not doomed to be consumed by false claims. In one leather-bound journal he found an entry from years ago where Richard had written bitterly of Carl's father, accusing him of trying to shift fences during drought years. It struck David with grim clarity that this battle was not born yesterday, but was the continuation of a feud stretching back generations, as if the Benson family carried a perpetual hunger for land that was never satisfied. Suddenly, David realized he was not only defending his inheritance but also fighting a cycle of encroachment that had broken others before him. The true escalation revealed itself not in a single dramatic act but in the steady accumulation of pressures: the official complaint from the zoning board, the missing archived documents, the sabotaged irrigation, the presence of strangers surveying. What was not theirs? Each piece, taken alone, might be dismissed as a nuisance, but together they formed a tightening noose designed to choke his resolve until he gave up. David felt the vineyard's silence shift. The once comforting rustle of leaves now carried an undertone of watchfulness, a sense that every step he took was mirrored by eyes just beyond the fence. He knew then that the conflict had crossed into a new phase, one where patience and logic were no longer enough, and that the only way to endure was to confront not only Carl's lies but the hidden machinery he had begun to set in motion behind them. The turning point arrived with a slow inevitability, like a storm that had been gathering at the horizon long before anyone thought to look up, and David, who had been balancing uneasily between stubborn determination and creeping fatigue, was thrust into a moment that transformed the conflict from a maddening contest of wills into something more visceral and dangerous. It began with the vines themselves, the very heart of the vineyard, for no matter how carefully he pruned or watered, he noticed that along the southern rows the leaves had begun to curl unnaturally, their edges browned, their growth stunted as if some invisible hand were strangling their roots. At first he suspected disease or pests, yet the pattern was too localized, too consistent, striking only the contested block as though it had been marked deliberately. He brought in an agronomist, a retired Italian grower who had worked vineyards all his life and whose hands bore the rough texture of soil embedded in every crease. The old man walked the rows slowly, crouched to touch the earth, rubbed the dust between his fingers, and finally said in a tone of quiet certainty that the vines had been poisoned. Not fatally yet, but with enough chemical residue to weaken them if. It continued. He named the substance, a cheap industrial herbicide used to clear lots for construction, and added with a weary shake of his head that no farmer would ever use such a thing near vines unless he wished to kill them. The revelation hit David with a cold weight. Poison meant intent, not neglect, not natural misfortune, but a hand that had entered the vineyard under cover of night and spilled venom into the soil. He did not need to ask whose hand, for the answer pulsed in the silence between the vines, in the faint chemical tang that lingered on the morning air, in the memory of Carl's steady gaze when he had spoken of the land, remembering better than ink. Still, certainty was not proof, and David's mind, shaped by years of architectural logic, demanded evidence that could hold in court, not just suspicion whispered among the leaves. He began to watch the vineyard at night, sitting with the lights off in the farmhouse kitchen where he could see the southern rose through the window, listening for footsteps or the scrape of metal. Several nights passed without incident, leaving him exhausted. But then, on a windless midnight, he saw a shadow moving along the fence line, stooped and deliberate, pausing at each post as though checking something. His heart surged, yet by the time he reached the porch, the figure had melted back into the darkness, leaving only the faint clink of metal against glass and the distant hum of a truck engine starting on the road beyond. At dawn, he found damp patches of soil near the base of 2 vines, darker than the surrounding earth, carrying a faint bitter odor that matched the agronomist's warning. The pressure tightened further when David returned to the county offices seeking an injunction to force an investigation, only to learn that Carl had preemptively filed a claim accusing David himself of contaminating the land with improper chemicals. The duplicity was staggering. The very crime Carl had committed against the vines was now being ascribed to their rightful owner, as if to ensure that when evidence surfaced it could be twisted in his favor. The clerk, bound by procedure, explained that both complaints would be reviewed simultaneously, meaning that David now stood accused alongside his accuser, a cruel symmetry that left him feeling trapped in a mirror maze where truth could be bent, until it vanished. It was then that David sought counsel from a local lawyer, not a polished city advocate, but a middle-aged woman named Ruth Callahan, who had spent years untangling disputes over water rights and farm boundaries. She listened patiently as he described the fence, the missing archive map, the poisoned vines, and the false complaint, and when he finished, she nodded slowly and said that while the situation was ugly, it was far from hopeless. She explained that Carl's strategy was to bury him in bureaucracy until he gave up, but that the law, if navigated with care, still offered footholds. Her advice was to document everything with meticulous precision, to treat each poisoned vine and each broken lock not as isolated nuisances, but as entries in a ledger of harassment that could not be ignored when presented as a whole. David left her office with a sense of fragile resolve, carrying a binder she gave him in which to record every incident, every date, every conversation. Yet the midpoint of the struggle was not marked only by the lawyer's words or the poisoned soil. It crystallized in a moment of human frailty when David confronted Carl directly one evening at the fence line. The air was thick with the scent of sunburned grass, the horizon glowing faintly red, and Carl was there as though waiting, leaning on the wire he had strung, his face lit by the fading light. David demanded to know why the vines were dying, why chemicals had been poured into the earth, and Carl responded with an expression that flickered between disdain and something almost like sorrow. He did not admit guilt, but in his anger he spoke too freely, remarking that vines planted where they do not belong always wither sooner or later, a phrase that carried the unmistakable taste of knowledge. For a heartbeat, David saw not just a neighbor but a man consumed by grievance. His life narrowed to the belief that if the world had taken from him, then he was entitled to take in return. That night, sitting alone at his desk with Ruth's binder open before him, David realized that the conflict had shifted irrevocably. It was no longer about a fence or a boundary line, nor even about documents hidden in archives. It was about survival, about whether the vineyard would live or die under the weight of hostility, and whether he himself had the strength to resist a neighbor who believed persistence could erase ownership as surely as poison erased leaves. The midpoint was the recognition that neutrality had ended. From this moment forward, every action he took would either defend the vineyard or surrender it to decay. He closed the binder with hands trembling, not with fear, but with the surge of decision, knowing that from now on the vineyard would not be defended only with documents and polite protests, but with vigilance, strategy, and the unyielding determination to protect what had been entrusted to him. The second escalation did not arrive with the sound of a hammer striking metal or the abrupt discovery of another fence line, but unfolded in a darker and more insidious pattern, a campaign that revealed Carl's willingness to go beyond harassment and into a calculated strategy of destruction. It began with a letter slipped into David's mailbox without a postmark. A single page typed in an anonymous font that accused him of violating environmental regulations, specifically alleging that he had contaminated the local water table with pesticide runoff. The accusation was baseless, yet its language carried an official tone, and for a moment David felt the crushing weight of dread that accompanies any notice implying legal liability. He brought it to Ruth Callahan, who confirmed it was not filed through proper channels and had no standing, but she warned him that such tactics were meant not to win outright but to sap his energy, to surround him with smoke until he doubted whether a fire had already taken hold. Within a week, more subtle acts followed. Small piles of gravel appeared at the edge of his driveway as though dumped carelessly by a passing truck, but when he investigated further, he discovered they were mixed with shards of glass, dangerous enough to shred tires if he had driven over them at speed. A section of his northern fence, untouched by dispute, was cut neatly as though by bolt cutters, leaving an open gap that would allow deer to wander in and strip the vines. He spent hours repairing it, but the message was clear. Nowhere on the property was safe from intrusion. At night he began to hear noises, low clinks of metal, the shuffle of footsteps across gravel, that vanished when he stepped outside with a flashlight, leaving only the wide silence of the fields. Each incident alone might have seemed the work of vandals, yet the cumulative effect was unmistakable. A deliberate effort to exhaust him, to break the fragile rhythm of his work until his vineyard became unmanageable. The breaking point came when he discovered fresh chemical burns on several vines near the disputed rows. The soil was damp, its smell acrid, and the leaves hung limp, their edges curled into brittle claws. David crouched beside them, fury rising in his chest, and for the first time he felt the sharp sting of helplessness that his uncle must have once known in his own battles with Carl's family. He collected soil samples, sealed them carefully, and stored them in Ruth's binder as evidence, but he knew the damage had already been done. The vines would not recover, and their loss would leave a visible scar in the neat geometry of the vineyard. It was more than sabotage. It was theft of time, for each vine required years of care to reach maturity, and now those years had been erased in a single night by a neighbor's hand. Carl's brazenness grew in proportion to David's silence. One evening, David returned from town to find Carl waiting at the disputed fence, leaning against the wire with the calm arrogance of a man convinced of his own invulnerability. He spoke casually, almost conversationally, remarking that vineyards required constant vigilance, that disease and poison could spread quickly, and that sometimes the land itself rejected intruders. The words carried no direct confession, yet the glint in his eyes revealed he knew exactly what he had done. David forced himself to remain composed, replying only that every word had been noted, and that one day soon the truth would surface. Carl smiled faintly, as if amused by the notion of truth, and turned away without further comment, his boots grinding the soil like a stamp of ownership. Determined not to let the escalation pass unanswered, David expanded his efforts beyond documentation. He contacted a private soil laboratory, arranging independent analysis of the poisoned rows, and began tracing the distribution of herbicides in the county. The agronomist who had first warned him confirmed quietly that such chemicals were sold cheaply at a nearby supplier known to cater to construction crews rather than farmers, and that Carl had been seen there more than once in recent months. Though circumstantial, the information strengthened David's resolve, offering a glimpse of the web Carl had spun to mask his sabotage beneath the guise of routine purchases. Yet the most unsettling escalation came not from the soil or the fences but from the sudden shift in community perception. Neighbors who once greeted David with cautious kindness began to avoid him, their conversations clipped, their glances wary. One man muttered that he had heard David was experimenting with chemicals on the vineyard. Another suggested he was planning to sell the land to developers after all. The rumors spread with the quiet efficiency of smoke, curling into every corner until David realized Carl had moved the battle into the realm of reputation, poisoning not just vines, but the trust of those around him. It was a tactic as corrosive as any herbicide, for isolation could weaken him as surely as disease weakened the roots of a plant. By the time David returned to Ruth's office with the soil samples and the reports from the agronomist, he felt the conflict pressing against him from all sides. She studied the evidence with sharp eyes, nodded gravely, and said they had enough to force an official investigation, though the process would not be swift. She warned him that Carl would likely intensify his efforts once he realized the net was tightening, and she advised caution, vigilance, and, above all, endurance. David left her office with the heavy awareness that the second escalation had transformed the dispute into open warfare, fought not with weapons but with chemicals, lies, and relentless pressure. The vineyard no longer felt like a quiet refuge but like a battlefield disguised in the calm symmetry of vines, and he knew that the struggle had reached a stage where only decisive proof, gathered with patience and resolve, could end it. The climax arrived not with sudden violence but with a convergence of all the tensions that had been building, as though every poisoned root, every false rumor, every missing document had been leading to a moment when the truth could no longer be hidden, and David, though exhausted, found himself standing in the center of a storm that he had no choice but to endure. It began when Ruth informed him that the laboratory results had returned, confirming without ambiguity that the chemical found in the soil of the vineyard matched the composition of the herbicide sold in the nearby supplier's yard, the same substance the agronomist had identified weeks earlier, a substance unsuited for viticulture and unmistakably harmful when applied in concentrated doses. Ruth explained that this evidence, combined with the samples David had collected and the testimony of the agronomist, would be enough to petition the county for criminal investigation. She urged him to remain calm, to prepare for confrontation, because once Carl realized the strength of the evidence, he would likely lash out with renewed aggression. The confrontation came sooner than expected. On a late afternoon, when the air was thick with heat and the vines shimmered faintly in the fading sun, David returned from town to find a small gathering near the southern fence. Carl was there, his posture stiff with defiance, and with him were several neighbors who had once been friendly but now looked uncertain, drawn by the rumors and curious to see what conflict might erupt. Carl, speaking loudly enough for everyone to hear, accused David of destroying the land with reckless use of chemicals, waving a crumpled sheet of paper that he claimed was proof of contamination. David felt the eyes of the neighbors shift toward him, their expressions a mix of suspicion and discomfort, and for a moment he feared the tide of lies had already poisoned the very community he needed for support. But then Ruth arrived, having anticipated such a moment, carrying a folder thick with documents and reports. With deliberate calm, she read aloud the findings of the laboratory, the testimony of the agronomist, and the confirmation that the same herbicide had been purchased by Carl at the supplier, the receipt signed with his name and dated only days before. The vines first showed signs of poisoning. The effect was immediate. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Faces that had shown doubt now shifted to shock, and Carl's mask of certainty began to crack. His hands trembled as he tried to argue, claiming he had purchased the chemical for clearing brush on his own property, that David must have planted the evidence, that this was nothing more than a conspiracy against him. But the words rang hollow, carried not by conviction but by desperation. It was in that moment, when his denial faltered, that the sheriff's car pulled onto the gravel road, dust rising behind it like a curtain, and 2 deputies stepped out with measured steps. They had been briefed, summoned by Ruth's petition, and armed with a warrant for Carl's arrest on charges of malicious destruction of agricultural property and unlawful use of toxic substances. The sight of the deputies approaching broke what little composure Carl still held, and he shouted incoherently about rights, about history, about how the land had always been his voice rising until it cracked with the weight of obsession. The neighbors stepped back, the air filled with uneasy silence as the deputies placed Carl in handcuffs, his body stiff with rage yet powerless to resist. For David, watching his adversary led away was not a moment of triumph, but of release, a heavy exhalation after months of pressure, as if the vineyard itself could breathe again. Yet he felt no joy in Carl's downfall, only the weary recognition that the land had been poisoned not just by chemicals, but by a man consumed by grief and bitterness, a man who had allowed his losses to fester until they became a weapon turned. Outward. As the deputy's car disappeared down the road, the neighbors lingered awkwardly, some offering quiet apologies, others avoiding his gaze, and David understood that while Carl was gone, the scars of the conflict would remain, etched into the soil and into the fragile trust of the community. Still, the vines stood, battered but alive, their roots holding stubbornly in the earth, and David, though tired, felt the first faint stirrings of renewal. The climax had not destroyed him, nor the vineyard, and though the struggle had left wounds that would take years to heal, he knew that he had endured the storm and that the truth, though nearly smothered, had finally broken free into the open air. In the weeks that followed Carl's arrest, the vineyard settled into a quieter rhythm, though silence no longer felt fragile or uneasy but carried the weight of survival, as if the land itself had endured the trial and was now exhaling in slow relief. The poisoned rose remained scarred, their leaves brittle and their fruit lost, yet the rest of the vine stood firm, and David poured himself into their care with a devotion that was not just practical labor, but an act of renewal. Each trimmed branch, and each measured drop of water a small defiance against the damage inflicted. The community, once clouded by rumors, began to return in tentative gestures of goodwill, a neighbor bringing over a basket of fruit, another stopping to offer advice about soil treatments, their words hesitant but sincere, and though David did not forget how quickly suspicion had spread, he accepted these gestures with quiet gratitude, recognizing that trust, like vines, could be regrown if tended with patience. Ruth remained a steady presence, guiding him through the legal aftermath, ensuring the vineyard's boundaries were affirmed beyond dispute and that the evidence against Carl was preserved for court. And in her calm persistence, David saw the rare kind of allyship that survived not because of shared history, but because of shared determination. Alone in the evenings, he sometimes thought of Carl, not with satisfaction at his downfall, but with a strange melancholy, for he understood now that the man had been less a villain than a prisoner of his own grief, and though his acts were cruel and destructive, they were also the echoes of a life hollowed out by loss and bitterness. Standing at the edge of the vineyard one dusk, the rows stretching before him in their familiar symmetry, David realized that the true resolution was not the arrest or the legal victory, but the simple endurance of the vines, the knowledge that what had been entrusted to him remained alive, and that his role was not to conquer, but to preserve. The vineyard was no longer only his uncle's legacy or a refuge from the mistakes of his past life as an architect. It was now a symbol of resilience, a place where the weight of conflict had tested him and left him changed, steadier, less haunted by guilt, and more certain of his place in the quiet, enduring dialogue between soil, vine, and the hands that cared for them.